In March of 1980, Nikon introduced its third flagship camera. Welcome to Jules Voto's Photo Focus. In this video, we're going to look back at the Nikon F3, Nikon's first flagship camera to offer exposure automation. Now, while the big story with this camera was aperture priority exposure automation, there was also another innovation in the F3, and that was the meter was built into the camera. So if you went to a waist level finder or the high magnification finder or the Prism Reflex sports finder, you had a meter. With the previous Nikon Pro cameras, the F and the F2, the meter was built into the photomic head, the photomic prism. And if you went to the waist level finder or one of the other viewfinders, you lost the meter. So this was a big deal. Also, this was the first Nikon flagship that required a battery for operation. The previous cameras, the F and the F2, just required the battery to operate the meter. Whereas with the F3, it had an electronic shutter, and the camera was basically dead without a battery, although you did have a single mechanical speed 1/60th of a second. So why don't we just go over some of the features of the F3. It had shutter speeds from 8 to 1/2000th of a second. Again, they're all electronically timed. So you would select the aperture, and the camera would select the shutter speed. And it wouldn't just select a 1/125th of a second or a 1/250th of a second. It could select the shutter speed that was required anywhere in between. All you did was set the shutter speed dial to A, and you were set for automation. Of course, in addition to the automated mode, the aperture priority, you also had full manual control. The camera, like the F2, featured a 1/80th of a second flash sync speed. It took the MD4 motor drive, which gave you up to 5.5 frames a second, and with the mirror locked up, 6 frames a second. It had exposure compensation, up to 2 stops, either plus or minus. It took 20 interchangeable screens, similar to the screens in the F and F2. And there was also a change to the metering system a little bit. In the previous Nikons, the F, the F2, and most other Nikons, 60% of the meter sensitivity was centered in the 12mm circle in the center of the viewfinder. With the F3, it became 80%. So you could almost call it a fat spot. So you had to be a little more careful when taking your readings, not to aim that 12mm circle at the sky, for example, then you would be underexposed. But it was a very reliable meter. Now, in a previous video, I talked about the introduction of the Nikon F2, which came out in 1971. And I said I didn't pick one up until several years ago. Well, that was not the case with the F3. The F3, like I said, became available in 1980. And towards the end of 1981, I picked one up, and I was very pleased with that camera. Now, we have to remember that it wasn't often that Nikon came out with a flagship camera. The F, the original F, was introduced in 1959, and it wasn't until 12 years later, in 1971, that the F2 came out, and then 9 years later, the F3. And the F3 remained in production till 2001. The F4 was introduced 8 years after the F3 in 1988, but they kept that F3 in production for 21 years. No other Nikon flagship camera has been in production that long. It was a very successful model. Now, when the camera was first introduced, there was some resistance from professional photographers over the automation and the electronic shutter, the fact that the camera required a battery for operation. And some pros felt, well, you don't need automation. But I disagree, and a lot of photographers fell in line after a while, because anything that will make your job easier, anything that will enable you to concentrate more on your subject is a positive thing. And the same thing when autofocus came out in '88 for the Nikon Pro models. There was some resistance to that. But again, it helps you concentrate more on your subject. You don't have to worry about focus as much. You don't have to worry about exposure with the auto exposure control. And today, could we imagine a camera without autofocus or auto exposure control? Now, if you saw my F2 look back video, you'll know that back at those days, I subscribed to a lot of photography magazines, and I cut out all the ads, all the test reports. I don't have quite as much on the F3. By the time the F3 came out, I was a little older. I was married, and I wasn't as much into the photo magazines, but I did save some ads. And this was a really nice one when the F3 first came out. And it's titled The New F3, A New Dimension in Professionalism. And Nikon ran some really good ads back then. And there were several pictures explaining the camera and also explaining that it was selected for use on the space shuttle. And there was a user report from Peterson's Photographic. This was January of '82. Nikon's F3, the bottom line on Nikon's top-of-the-line camera. And it went over the camera and all its accessories. I also have the lab report from Popular Photography. This is dated April of 1981. And Popular Photography, as I said earlier with my Nikon F2 video, really goes into detail. They have all kinds of charts and graphs on the camera. And this one I really like. This was with the camera with the MD4 attached, which I did buy. That was the first motor drive I ever bought for a camera, was the MD4 for the Nikon F3. And it was a very reliable camera. However, I had one incident back in, I believe it was 1990. Went to New York with my wife, who was pregnant at the time with my second son, and my sister, and took along my youngest son, who was about 5 at the time, and we went to the Statue of Liberty. Of course, my wife couldn't go up, so my sister stayed with her, and me and my son went to the top of the Statue of Liberty. I had been taking lots of pictures in New York earlier that day. I get to the very top, around the crown, and there's windows up there, and I look out. It's a great view. I press the shutter release on my F3, advanced the film, and the shutter kept firing. Every time I advanced film, the shutter fired. So some linkage broke. That was the only problem I ever had with that camera. In fact, that was the only problem I ever had with any Nikon camera that I bought new. Now, I've bought used cameras and had issues with them occasionally. Of course, you don't know how that camera was treated over the course of its life, but never had an issue with a new Nikon camera except that F3. When I got back, took it to the local shop that I used for repairs, and it was a simple fix. But I was really surprised. I was really disappointed after getting to the very top to find that happen. But otherwise, it was an extremely reliable camera. I know when the camera was first introduced, there was some talk from Nikon, and it was indicated in some of these lab and test reports, that the LCD had a limited life. It was a liquid crystal display for the readouts in the viewfinder, and Nikon said it had a life of between 6 and 8 years. That did not prove to be true. It had a much longer life. In fact, when I finally got rid of my F3 to buy an F4, after a little over 10 years of ownership, I would say, the LCD was fine, and I haven't really heard anything on that since. So let me know if you have an F3, how you feel about it. Is it still going strong? Do you prefer it to the F2? Now, I have always said I feel that the F2 is the finest mechanical camera ever made. Now, the F3 is not a mechanical camera, obviously. It's electronic, and I think it's a great camera. But I still think I prefer the F2. There's just something about that F2. So, again, if you own an F3, let me know what you think. And if you have any questions or comments on this video, please leave them in the comments below. I always try to respond to all questions and comments. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. I publish a new video every Monday morning and Wednesday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. So thanks for watching, and I will talk to you soon.